Welcome to the Expanding Consciousness podcast with your hosts, Michael Wally and Nikolas. In this podcast, we explore ways to sharpen our awareness, make life more enjoyable, be a little kinder, become more authentic, less reactive, more present, and ultimately expand our consciousness. We're happy to have you along for the ride, and if you do enjoy these conversations, please leave a review or a comment, as this goes a long way for us. Enough of the promotional talk, and enjoy this episode.
Hello, welcome to the podcast. Today we're finally getting around to the topic of psychedelics or plant medicines, perhaps the preferred nomenclature there. So why don't you kick us off, Nick? What are some of your experiences with psychedelics or plant medicine?
Yeah, sure. I think my first experience with psychedelics was probably with MDMA, maybe 10 years ago. And I'm saying that because I recently watched the Netflix documentary, How to Change Your Mind, where they talk about psychedelics. And there they also put MDMA inside of psychedelics. So I guess it's kind of a psychedelic. But that was kind of the gateway. Then after that, I had some experiences with LSD, which were really mind-bending and opened me up to find these substances somehow intriguing and interesting. But my real entrance was with ayahuasca in 2017, where I went to the retreat center where we had 2 ceremonies in a row. And this one was really life-changing, I'd say. It's difficult to talk about these experiences a little bit because they're also deeply personal, and when people speak about their experience with ayahuasca and so on, it's usually very boring. It's similar like when people speak about their dreams, where it's like, you can't really relate. It seems to be important for the person, whatever happened, but it has nothing to do with you, so it's not that interesting. But I can definitely say that I experienced what they call ego death, and merged with I don't know, something else, with the greater good or whatever. And it really felt profound at the time, but it also shattered my worldview completely. And after that, I really had to change how I look at the world, it took me a long time to integrate what I experienced there. And in some sense, I feel that I'm still maybe integrating now, 5 years later. And after that, I had a couple more experiences with mushrooms and so on. But that was my entrance. How about you?
Okay. Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess at the beginning it was maybe more around cannabis and very recreational, if you want to call cannabis a psychedelic. I know we did an episode specifically on that. So we'll stick to the more traditional psychedelics, I suppose. At some point, I had a number of mushroom experiences, generally with friends, and very, very recreational. Kind of sitting around watching funny TV or whatever. Walls are moving or shifting. Kind of maybe almost stereotypical in a sense. That was in my early 20s. I want to say maybe very late teens. And then now, maybe in my early 30s, I started having a number of experiences specifically with mushrooms, and those were a lot more inward focused. They weren't like, oh, let's go have some fun. It was more like, hey, let's dig up some psychological baggage here. Let's get into it and see if I can change myself with it. Right? I mean, I kind of hopped on that bandwagon of, hey, psychedelics are a really powerful way of dealing with your your traumas or your difficulties, and so it was very appealing in that sense. And I'd say that I did not get what I was looking for exactly, but I got a lot more than I bargained for, certainly in the long run. Yeah, I mean, I agree that the integration can be something that goes on for years, potentially maybe even your entire life, considering how profound these experiences can be, and also how far removed they are from your day-to-day experiences, right? Like, how do you integrate something that you've never really experienced before? Even something if you've experienced it a number of times. I mean, for example, with mushrooms, for me, I've done it dozens of times over the past 10 years or so, and it's there's always a lot of commonality in the experiences. It always brings up a lot of the same feelings, going through a lot of the same. mm, I guess, for lack of a more precise term, a lot of very similar experiences, right? Like distortion of senses is a very common thing that I experienced early on in my trips. And then also kind of getting to, for me, generally getting to like a very glowing, very blissful space where, everything is right in the world. And then the journey becomes, as far as integration, how do I conduct myself in a way that honors that and maybe gets me in that direction, right? Like I want to be this way all the time. Now how do I do that? I'm not going to take drugs all the time. I'm not going to take psychedelics all the time.
Yeah, there's this famous line by Alan Watts, I think, when you get the message, hang up the phone. It's some advice that goes around the psychedelic scene for people who overdo it and who want to be in that space all the time. And I think it can be healthy if you do it too often. So yeah, get some experience or find some profound experience with meaning for you and then integrate it would be the idea. And that's something which is, I'd say, underappreciated, because it's not the cool part. It's not the experience itself. It's not the ecstatic experience. It's the boring part afterwards, where you also want to integrate that in your life. But ultimately, if we don't do integration, then it was all for nothing. Then it was just, fireworks and a short-lived experience, which can also be helpful or nice at times. But the possibilities that are offered by psychedelics are that it can really change lives, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that kind of brings us to an interesting point before we get to integration, which I'd love to get around to integration. But what is it about the psychedelic experience in your opinion or in your experience that can be so transformative?
Really good question. I ask myself often this question, and also, like, what is it that why are people even interested and drawn to psychedelics? So for me, it was somehow naturally maybe just being curious at the possibility of being in a different mindset. It's somehow exciting, but I think that what psychedelics do actually, not always, but the most helpful for me was when they expanded my consciousness, which, funny enough, is the name of our podcast. But it's actually exactly
Mm.
this, at least how it felt to me. So I had a very vivid sort of analogy in my mind after I came back from my first like strong ayahuasca experience, and it's like, do you know when you fly with an commercial airplane and then you get down and you still have pressure in your ears,
Sure.
and then maybe you forget about it, and after sometimes you pop your nose and the pressure like suddenly goes away and you realize, oh my god, there's been so much noise I haven't been hearing, but it was there all the time. And it felt like this on high dose of ayahuasca, where sort of your consciousness pops open, and you realize, oh my god, all of this input was there all the time. I was just not tuned into it.
Mm.
And it felt like a familiar experience, right? So it felt like a little bit
Mm.
like homecoming, right? And
Yeah.
or it feels like you're going to a place where you have definitely been before more than once in your life, perhaps maybe where we come from, or similarly. And just being in that space and taking it in just has a positive impact on your life, I'd say.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I think that's pretty good. It's an apt analogy of coming off of an airplane and not realizing that your hearing is maybe a little bit muffled, right? Or there's a certain lack of clarity. And I like that you mentioned this idea of kind of opening ourselves up to more information in a sense, right? If you just want to put it in very general term. And that brings me to the thought I'm going to touch on Aldous Huxley here, right? He wrote an essay. I probably mentioned it before, even The Doors of Perception, and he described it as our mind as a reducing valve, and taking a psychedelic as a way of sort of opening up that valve to let more information through. And I think that's a good way to think about it, right? And keeping in mind that this is really just a framework. We're not talking about anything exact here. But I'd say that is a good way of describing the way that I experience it personally, because initially there's sort of an opening up and there's a lot more information coming on. I experience a lot of what's called synesthesia, which is kind of a mixing, a blending of the senses where it's very disorienting, right? Because compared to your normal day-to-day experience, it's novel in a sense, right? You're perceiving things that you don't normally perceive. There's maybe extraneous information that your mind hasn't been able to properly categorize or something. And so there's very, very disoriented initially, for myself at least. And I assume other people experience this as well. But after a while, especially, and this is where surrender, letting go to the experience really is extremely important, because after a while I find that there's almost like a coming back together, a reification, or kind of an increase in cohesion between all of this information that's coming in, and it kind of becomes clear. It's like that point where you popped your ears and now you're like, oh, all of that muffled stuff, that some of it was jargon and I didn't know what it was. Now I can hear it clearly. Now I can see this clearly. And I think that's really, certainly for me, the value of these experiences is seeing something from an altered perspective, to whatever degree it might be extremely altered, but you're recognizing that your experience is highly dependent upon yourself, maybe more so dependent upon yourself than it is on anything that's happening externally, right? So you can take a psychedelic and go through the exact same experience or go through the exact same event, exact same motions, and have a totally different experience, right? And that is dependent not on the events, but that is dependent on you, that is dependent on your internals. And I think that's probably one of my biggest takeaways from psychedelics in general.
Yeah, that's a true experience for me as well. So even sometimes during the psychedelic experience, the experience is changing based on your internal feelings or moods. And it's something you can notice and learn from, right? So I think that's how bad trips come to life. So, you maybe remember some suppressed feeling you don't want to deal with, and then the act of pushing that away, leads you sort of into a dark either headspace or just a dark experience. And this is where letting go comes in very handy. So that's kind of a skill that you want to have handy when engaging in psychedelic experiences, or at least you can really also practice them with psychedelics. I think there's no better tool to practice this skill, if it is even a skill, to the degree where, if you take psychedelics in high enough doses, it's not even a question anymore. Surrendering, it's like, you're kind of forced to surrender, because if we're talking about DMT, you're sort of strapped to the front of a rocket that is going straight up, and there's milliseconds of your decision left, of your voluntary decision, and then the rest you're being surrendered, sort of. But actually at lower doses I find it more interesting, because then you get to play with that and you get to extend your skill. And I also found it interesting how you described it before. Maybe we can tie in another analogy in here, which we had in the last episode about meditation, where you talked about kind of the lens that is sometimes like muddled up or not clear, and then gets cleared by a psychedelic experience. So especially with LSD, I had this experience that it seems for a couple of hours that the filters sort of lift, right? So the filters that are usually in place for your experience, the human experience, are not there for a moment. And yeah, it can be disorienting. It can also be really fun, right? So I also had moments on LSD where it was like hysterical because it seems that you're seeing things for the first time, or you're just being in your body can feel really funny when the filters are lifted for a moment. And then there's also lots of space for new inspiration to come in because it feels like you're seeing things for the first time.
Yeah. 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 I think that's a really good way to put it. And you touched on a couple of important points there. So I'll see if I can kind of maybe summarize or tease them out a little bit. So one thing is this idea of kind of like magnification of mind. I mean, psychedelics, I think the word even means like mind manifesting, right? And I think in a lot of ways, it can expose us to this experience where things are very fluid. You can, if you want to be a little bit more concrete, you could say your emotions are very fluid, right? And then you start to realize that I can change that very quickly and very drastically. And, it could be something as simple as a thought that changes that, right? Like, and then you touched on how this is kind of maybe one of the traps or one of the kind of pitfalls in terms of, having a bad experience, right? There's this kind of like reinforcing that ends up happening. And it's like, well, I'm having a bad experience. And so now I push that away. And in pushing that away, I create more bad experience, right? And then I don't want that. And then I don't, and I push harder and I push harder. And it's just this reinforcing cycle where it just kind of gets worse and worse. And I think one of the important things that this is teaching is just, the influence that our thoughts and emotions have on our experience. And normally it's pretty subtle, right? You can have a negative thought and be going through your day and it doesn't really affect you too much. But the potential for it to affect you, I think, is one of the things that I was going to say meditation, but also psychedelics shows you is that, okay, that negative thought, that can be magnified, that can drastically affect your day. And so maybe it can encourage to some degree a little bit of motivation for mental housekeeping or something, I suppose you could say. But that's kind of what came to mind from your share there. What do you think?
Yeah. So mind manifesting is really a well chosen word. Like, I don't know who came up with this, but it's so on point to choose this word for this experience because yeah, everything gets, not everything, but a lot of things get brought to the surface and you get to see it. So yeah, I agree. It's you sort of also see where you're at in terms of mental health. How good are you in surrendering? And all of these skills and things matter also in your sober life. So it's a really good tool also to assess yourself, see where you stand. It's a tool that can be used for many purposes. And I mean, the purposes are only being researched right now. They're using it for therapy, for PTSD, for depression, for all sorts of mental illnesses. And I see really a lot of potential. It's, in a way, it's really exciting to be alive in a time where these tools are sort of available, even though mostly illegal still in the world, but you can get to them and we're able to talk openly about them on the internet right here. So they are available. And yeah, maybe it's a good point to mention the stoned ape hypothesis. You know about it? You heard about it?
Yeah, that's Terence McKenna, right?
Yep.
If you're very familiar with it, maybe you can give the overview, or I can give at least what I understand of it. Basically, that as part of our evolution, if you buy into this course of events, of course, it's a model. It's not an exact thing, but basically that as apes came down out of the trees, they found mushrooms because mushrooms tend to grow in ruminating animals, dung, right? And they would potentially try these, and the expansion of sensory input that these psychedelics afford essentially was an important step in evolution, right? Like it started to develop our capacity for self-awareness, perhaps. That's kind of my high level foggy understanding of stoned ape theory. Maybe you can add a little bit more color or precision to it.
That's precisely how I remember it. So he mentioned it in the book Food of the Gods. And he talked about how psychedelics, like you described, how they found them, how this could be an evolutionary advantage. And I think it's not obvious that this would be an evolutionary advantage, psychedelics, because I'm mostly rendered useless when I take psychedelics, like except of, I don't know, entertainment, philosophizing, reflecting myself. I'm not. I don't expect to be a better hunter, but there is the case to be made that visual acuity gets better. Maybe things what we see as visual distortions could be helpful in hunting. Certainly, your focus increases. Terence also argues that your libido increases, and that somehow would be like an advantage evolutionary. But in any case, he argues that this is kind of the thing that shifted us from Homo erectus to Homo sapiens, because there is, in fact, like, I think in the scientific community, still a gap to understand why the frontal cortex in us humans developed so quickly and increased in size in the last 100,000 years. I think it's not really clear what made that shift exactly. Yeah, and he makes the point that, yeah, maybe it was the psychedelics, like the psilocybin that was lying around. And I don't think it's a widely accepted theory, but I find it really cool, and I'd like to think that it happened that way. That would be a really cool twist on human history. But who knows? I mean, to some degree, Terence McKenna was a bit crazy, but also very entertaining.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, listened to quite a few of his talks. He seems fairly brilliant, right? But he can, yeah. In any case, yeah, it is a very interesting theory. In terms of like therapy or something, though, which we kind of touched on. I was listening to a podcast interviewing. I'm not going to remember his name, but interviewing a guy that came up with internal family systems, and they touched on psychedelics and why psychedelics, and internal family systems might fit really well together. And I think I really liked this idea that they shared, and that's essentially that within the context of internal family systems, and just to give a tiny bit of color to that, right, is basically this idea that you have all these different parts within you, which may not be entirely in alignment. They're sort of playing differing, sometimes warring roles. And for example, you have different aspects of yourself, managers, and at a more extreme level, firefighters, who can kind of repress different aspects, right? They're kind of keeping the exile, which is the part of yourself which may have really intense emotions that you needed to repress or whatever, couldn't feel or whatever, right? They're keeping that in the closet. And essentially that taking psychedelics can make the managers, make the firefighters kind of stand down, right? And allow some of these more repressed aspects of yourself to come to the surface. That's one way to look at it. Or another way is it's just kind of making some of the unconscious stuff conscious, right? It's bubbling it up so that you can become aware of it and potentially do something useful with it. Or, I think in bad cases, which I'd be a bit remiss if we didn't, if we just painted this as the entirely rosy picture around psychedelics, but there are potential downsides, especially for people that are maybe like predisposed to bipolar disorder. I've heard that it can make you go schizo in that case. And there are certainly people that have bad experiences and those kind of have long lasting rippling effects in their lives. So I'm a little bit curious on the darker side of psychedelics, if you have any thoughts there.
I don't have any personal experiences at the ceremonies where I was there wasn't any dark experiences. I've certainly read about them on the internet. There's cases about this. There's cases about people even doing suicide after psychedelic experiences. I think this is something that can happen. I mean, it's a powerful tool. Exactly like you describe, you can bring up some stuff that is even maybe internally guarded. And this can be a quick way to go there and to face these experiences. But obviously, if you want to face intense trauma, intense memories, you need a good container for it. And good containers are being developed like by institutions like MAPS that are doing it with MDMA, but also with psilocybin. I think we're gonna find the good containers for it. Until then, it's happening in the underground. And I think that some of the indigenous cultures have some hundreds of year old frameworks, and they have experts, aka shamans, who are very skilled to work with these kind of things and who are comfortable to bring people together with their memories and traumas. But it's also an industry that sprung out of this, let's say, trend, because it's becoming somehow trendy and people are hearing about it, people are interested in it, people want to solve their own shit, their own trauma faster than, we can supply and legalize all of this stuff. So yeah, I think there's many retreat centers in South America. Nowadays you don't even have to fly to South America. For example, in Europe there's many retreat centers by people who, I don't know how they obtain their licenses, their expertise. It's just a huge unregulated market, and you just have to trust these shamans by your gut feeling. And of course, I think bad shit can happen there. It's like unavoidable.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think even more so than like a therapeutic relationship, which is just based on, say, talk therapy or something, when you're going into a relationship with whoever is holding space for you, whether that be like a trip sitter, just a friend, or someone who's maybe a little bit more trained, is you really have to trust them, right? You really have to trust they have your best interest in mind and that they can help you navigate this space, a very unknown, potentially very scary space, in a productive manner, because you can potentially be traumatized in this experience. Matter of fact, I'll give a shout out to the Psychedelic Passage podcast. They did an episode interviewing a pair of folks that had a rather bad experience, with what seemed like a very legitimate ayahuasca setup, and the person running it was just really not well suited, perhaps hadn't done enough of their own work. So, in that sense, maybe we should talk a little bit around what does a good experience look like in terms of setup, in terms of the people that are taking care of you, in terms of the preparation. So I'll just kind of chime in on that, and maybe you can, comment back, or add in any, fill in any gaps that I miss. Initially, I think it's something to take some time to prepare for. It's not something generally to just dive right into. Read trip reports, see what other people have experienced, see if that's something that you're okay experiencing, right? Because I think a lot of times we can come to psychedelics with the hope, well, I'm just going to take this drug, who knows what's going to happen, and then I'm going to come out better on the other side, which I think is, not necessarily the truth. And I would say in most cases is really an insufficient way of looking at it. So just being prepared at what you can potentially experience. Of course, there's the idea, perhaps a bit cliche, but very true, that you really can't prepare for a psychedelic experience, just because no matter what, you're never gonna get what you expect. At least that's been my personal experience. So yeah, just having a little bit of a sense of what you're getting into before you take the dive, and then doing a little bit of preparation. And really, this is the start of integration, which really starts before you even go through the experience. And that's like looking at, what do you want out of this? Right? What do you want out of this experience? Why are you doing this? What do you hope it will bring? What insights, do you hope it will bring? How do you hope it will change your life? And so that requires looking at, some of the dark parts within us. You can refer back to like the shadow work, right? I mean, I think shadow work is perfect preparation for a psychedelic experience, right? And then, having a safe environment, somewhere that's, fairly comfortable. If it's your first time, probably outdoors, in an unknown environment may not be the best choice, but somewhere comfortable, somewhere safe, somewhere where there's not a lot of potential for negative influences. So maybe don't do it in a frat house, or right, a place where there's a lot of unknowns. Do it in a controlled environment, and ideally, I would say with someone who has sat with other people before, and has sat with the medicine themselves, of course, and done some work on themselves, and who's there really without an agenda other than to keep you safe, and to support you in whatever unfolds, I think is important. And then finally, just to kind of end cap it, and certainly not to trivialize or downplay the importance of this aspect, but there's a lot of integration that goes on afterwards as well, right? Which I think we'll probably get a little bit more into, exactly what that looks like, and how important it is. But that's kind of like an overview of a setup for a good experience, in my opinion and experience.
Yeah, I think that's even comprehensive. It maybe depends, what do you want from an experience. I think there's also, how to say, if you want to have an experience just for fun, I think it's also possible with psychedelics, and certainly people are having like thousands of them every day at festivals and so on. But I probably not recommend doing psychedelics at a festival, for example, to any beginner. So you can also do, it's also possible to take psychedelics solo. Also not something I'd recommend to first time experiences. You can take them with somebody like you described. You can take them with with a group of friends, or you can take them even in some kind of ceremonial setting. And like you say, I think maybe the only thing I would add is, be with people that you trust. Don't
Yeah.
don't do it with people that you just met, or where you're unsure about them, or were just acquaintances. It's probably not a bad idea, because you're making yourself vulnerable.
Yeah.
You're putting yourself in a vulnerable position, together with people, and you want to do that only with people that you know well. So that's sort of a base recommendation. But yeah, then let's also talk a bit about integration. What do you think are some good tools for integration?
Yeah, yeah. Well, like I said, it kind of starts before the trip even begins. Potentially, something like shadow work is very valuable, both before and potentially after. Really, I think a lot of it comes down to reflecting upon your experience. What did you experience in that psychedelic headspace? What insights or lessons did you learn? And some of that might come down to a little bit of interpretation, because not everything you experience will easily translate. And I think that's kind of one of the main aspects of integration, is essentially you're kind of trying to bridge the gap between these two experiences, right? You took some psychedelics and went in a totally different place, a totally different experience, very, very novel. And now you're out of it. And, you have no idea, like, in a sense, you don't know where you were, right? And it can be really hard to get back there. So for me personally, a lot of it's been like, connecting the psychedelic experience to the everyday experience. And you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. And that's how our everyday experience really does, in my opinion, in my experience, really does mirror a lot of what we go through on psychedelics. So it is significantly amplified while you're on psychedelics. But in your day-to-day experience, you go through the same things. You go through, the waves of different emotions, of intensity and overwhelm. It's just much, much more subtle, I should say. And there's always an opportunity for surrender in your day-to-day experience as well. And again, I really appreciate that you said that psychedelics can be sort of a proving ground for learning to surrender, and practicing surrender. Because I honestly feel that that's probably one of the most important things that we can get out of psychedelics. But in general, in terms of integration, a lot of it is, it can be like journaling, it can be meditation, I think one good way to approach it is to see it as an ongoing process, not something like, okay, I took psychedelics, now I'm going to journal for a couple of weeks or something, meditate for a couple of weeks, and I'm going to be done integrating, because that's not really the case.
What helps me a lot is if I write down stuff either during the trip if I'm capable or right afterwards. Because one problem I have with the psychedelic experiences is that if they sort of trigger an expanded state of consciousness, then some of the things you experience are things you're not able to actually contain with your sober consciousness, which makes things really difficult to describe, because you know how difficult it is sometimes to describe an experience to somebody with words. Even though you experienced it, it's super difficult.
Yeah, yeah. I totally agree. It can be, like you said earlier, it's kind of like trying to describe a dream to someone in a lot of ways. And partially that's because as a society, we don't have these conversations very much, right? Like we don't have a language developed around this to communicate about it in a clear or sort of systematized way, so that we're all using the same language. And this is where you start getting into the realms of things that sound a little bit more woo, right? Kind of a little bit more out there, right? When people start talking about energy or something, and it's like a very nebulous term, but then when you actually experience it yourself, and I think psychedelics often, kind of bring this to people's attention, is then you realize like, okay, I don't actually have language to describe this. And yeah, maybe something like energy is the best way to describe it. And yeah, at least then we can kind of be somewhat on the same page and be speaking somewhat the same language, even though, we really don't have a very good sense of how closely, related our experiences were.
Yeah, and the fact that they are similar to dreams, that's also why writing down stuff helps, because if you write, similar like when you wake up from a dream, if you write things down, you'll be able to remember things even later on in the day, which you maybe usually would have forgotten. And obviously you want to take as much back from these experiences as you can. And in these experiences, sometimes you can have very deep and profound experiences of particular feelings, or I don't know, maybe you experienced some joy that was usually repressed, or you just enjoy the fact that you now have direct access to some kind of love feeling. And that's something which you may want to take back with you, in the sense that maybe even during the experience you try to anchor these feelings. So you try to kind of take a mental snapshot of sorts of whatever you experience, and then this is something you can bring back into your life and either try to bring yourself back to that state, or use it kind of as a goal to, okay, this is the desired state, which definitely is possible because I experienced it, even though with a very powerful tool. And then think about, how do I bridge the gap to that state? And then there's other tools like mindfulness, meditation, breathwork, all of these things that we're already talking about, which can help you get there and finally, as a goal, really integrate the experience into day-to-day life, if that's even possible. But at least that would be the goal. I would be curious, did you ever have any really like high dose psychedelic experiences where something like ego death happens and you have really like deep experiences?
Yeah, yeah. High dose. Yeah, I've definitely, in my early days of experimentation, maybe 8 or 10 years ago, maybe, I had kind of upped the dose at times. I was kind of really interested in psychedelics and thought this was, this is it, right? This is going to fix everything for me. I just need to kind of do it the right way, get the right insights. I was a little obsessed at the time. And I think at the highest, I probably took maybe 9 grams or so of mushrooms, which, for anyone listening, that's maybe 3 times the recommended dose. It was not an enjoyable experience. I will say that. Essentially, I was kind of freaking out a lot. I was like, okay, wait, well, I took way too much. This is not good. I was like really overwhelmed. I spent actually the majority of the experience enjoying myself, but I was kind of catatonic, you could say. I had my wife my head on my wife's lap and we were just listening to records for, several hours. And that was kind of like the whole experience. I did not bring very much back from that experience because it was so far gone. That had no grounding in my day-to-day experience that I could bring much of anything back. Right. As far as like ego death or something, I know that that's sort of like a cliche, or there's certainly some heaviness around that term or that idea. I would say that more often than not, I do experience some degree of ego death. I do tend to go through a phase of believing I'm going to die,
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that is kind of grounded in this distortion of perception of reality, like distortion of perception of my body, like, oh, I can't feel this, I must be dying or something, or I'm feeling this other thing that I've never felt before, oh, I must be dying, right? So that tends to be my erroneous conclusion quite often. And then usually the way the experience goes is I just have to surrender. I usually reach a point where I'm like, well, if I'm going to die, then I guess that's what's going to happen. And that's usually where the experience kind of opens up into something where there's so much more clarity, so many more insights coming through. And it really tends to become a very beautiful experience for me. I mean, indescribably beautiful, like tears streaming down my face and just love pouring out of me in every which way for just about everything that I could imagine for. And of course, those feelings of unity, like where there's no separation between you and I. And it's really something that's kind of difficult to describe, even having had those experiences, trying to kind of like reminisce and be like, okay, what did that really even feel like to me? It feels like you're alive, like you're on, like you were dead up until this point, and now you are just totally alive, totally on. For me, often, interestingly, especially after I've gone through that sort of like catatonic phase, I find myself actually much more capable once I've gotten into like the glowing headspace. Like sometimes I'll be cooking dinner or something, and I'll be doing like 3 or 4 things, at a time in a much more coordinated way than I would have been otherwise capable, in my normal state. So yeah, it's kind of in the peak experience area for me.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
First of all, 9 grams. What is wrong with you? Like, why would you do that? This would never cross my mind
Yeah,
to do that.
yeah, not a good idea. Do not recommend.
Yeah, but interestingly enough, it seems to have culminated in a positive experience. Perhaps challenging at times. I can imagine. Yes. So it's again then about kind of the struggle of surrender, and what probably ego death signifies exactly that for me. I know it's a term where lots of people project lots of things to, but I think it's just describing this sort of illusionary death that happens, where you are very convinced that you're actually dying. So you actually start to think about probably things you think moments before you die, and you don't want to let go, or you're fighting with letting go. And if you're finally able to let go, then you're sort of bursting out the other side, and it feels like a rebirth there. And it's really a profound experience, because it is like you died, because you went through the routine of what you will go through when you actually died. And that's, I think, a really powerful thing, especially if the experience is that after letting go, you're sort of reborn, and your consciousness does not end, and it's not suddenly dark. Then it's a really interesting experience, and I think you can take a lot from it, because it gives you a new outlook on end of life. And death and end of life are topics that are not discussed enough, even though they're the very thing that keeps all of us moving, actually. But we sort of suppress them collectively. And also me personally, I think it was something that I was suppressing and not even looking at, even though I think it's important to look at it early in life, to be aware of it and make good choices in your life, to not be surprised by it in the end. So it's overall a really good thing to have an early on illusionary ego death happening, and leaves you with a really good outlook on life. But okay, so you mentioned that on high doses of mushrooms, you become even more alive, and maybe you can even do things in parallel. Another thing that I noticed is that synchronicities seem to happen more often on psychedelic. Is that something you experienced?
Yeah. Yeah, synchronicity. That's an interesting realm. I've kind of pushed against for some time in the past, and just kind of been like, this is kind of just like confirmation bias in a way. One way that I would kind of describe it, and this also kind of describing what I think psychedelics kind of brings to the table, or what you're experiencing, is what I would characterize as like non-linear thinking, like very, very creative thinking. Parts of your mind that were not previously connected are now connected. And what comes along with that is the ability to see patterns that previously you just weren't capable of seeing, because it required connecting otherwise very disparate, very unconnected, parts of your mind, or things in sort of your representation of the world. And I think that's where, this idea of synchronicity kind of falls in, is now all of a sudden you're able to see the patterns. I think those synchronicities were always there. All of those patterns, all of those cycles were always at work. You just weren't aware of them. And taking psychedelics kind of lights up your brain and creates a higher degree of interconnectivity, so that you're no longer kind of bound to a single train of thought. Now you can kind of expand out in different ways, right? And I think that also, maybe to some degree is also synonymous with the expansion of consciousness that potentially happens.
Yeah. For anybody who never heard about the word synchronicity, means basically when two events happen. Most of the time we will talk about an internal event and an external event, where we thought before they weren't connected, but they happen in a way that it's really clear to us that there seems to be a connection. To give some example, I don't know, you're thinking about your friend who you haven't talked about in 2 years, and in that very moment he calls you. So that would be an external event, and before there was an internal event, you're thinking about him, and there should be no causality, no relation there, but somehow, it's so obvious that you think there is. And this seems to be some sort of a universal experience. I think everybody experienced synchronicities in their lifetime, and maybe put them off usually as coincidences. Maybe they really are also coincidences, of course. But that's the kind of the interesting realm that psychedelics throw you into, where this suddenly seems to be a possibility, and where reality seems to be more malleable than in the usual state. Or perhaps, like you describe, the synchronicities happen all the time, but we just don't have the capacity to pay attention to them or to see them. But so it starts a connection between your internal space and the external space, and you notice that there's a correlation, and that you can actually influence the external reality, which is trippy, but also seems to be true somewhat in sober life. And that's like an interesting realization that sends you down like a whole rabbit hole on its own.
Right. Yeah. I'd maybe even make this definition, this idea of synchronicity, I'd relate it back to the idea of during the psychedelic experience, realizing that your thoughts can have a profound effect on your emotion. Like, right. I mean, synchronicity, it's really all about causal connection, right, behind the scenes that we're not really consciously aware of. And I think in day-to-day life, we might trivialize it and be like, oh, well, I can have some negative thoughts and whatever and still be fine or something. But then when you're in the psychedelic experience, you have those negative thoughts and they send you in a complete tailspin, right? I think in a way that's kind of showing us some of that synchronicity, right? It's showing us some of that causal connection between something that might seem like a trivial thought that's passing through your head and then your emotional state. And I think the way that we kind of bridge the gap between the psychedelic experience is that causal connection is very obvious, right? It's like, okay, I had that thought and okay, now I'm in this awful emotional tailspin. Whereas in your day-to-day life, that connection might be a little bit further apart. It might be harder to see it, right? And so I think that's one of the ways that we can kind of bridge the gap between your day-to-day experience and your psychedelic experience is realizing sort of that slight disparity in the way that it plays out, but realizing that those rules are still at play, right? Those synchronicities, or however you'd like to characterize it. I think that's probably a good, reasonable way to say it.
Exactly. So when you're on these powerful substances and everything is more malleable, it is affecting you, and that's also a good way to learn that probably it's affecting you in everyday life, and that makes you maybe a bit more picky about what thoughts pop up in your mind. Because after all, we can choose what we focus on. I mean, we cannot choose our thoughts, but we can choose where we put our attention, and it's good learning experience to integrate also in everyday life. Another interesting tool, perhaps, for integration would be microdosing.
Yeah.
Just to tease the idea. So it would be to take psychedelic substances at the very threshold level or below of where you can feel them or perceive them in terms of like visual effects, emotional effects, or generally mental effects. And it's very popular, used by many people. People claim it helps them a lot. And so my theory is that it could also help with integration.
Yeah. Oh, no doubt. I mean, I think it kind of gives you, just like the subtlest taste of the experience, again, kind of subtly puts you into a similar mindset potentially. I mean, of course, we're questioning what exactly a threshold dose is, right? And one thing I found in my own microdosing experiences is over time, and having, done a lot of the work, as well as, had a lot of regular normal dose experiences, right? Psychedelic experiences, that the amount I need for a microdose becomes less and less because I'm more and more sensitive to it, right? I don't know, just sort of side note there. Have you microdosed much or experimented with that yourself?
Yeah, I played around with it. It's mostly used. My impression is when I read articles online about it, in the literature about it, it seems to be used sort of as a tool for productivity and getting stuff done. For me personally, it's not useful at all because it brings me into a headspace where I'd like to, I don't know, be outside, socialize, or not work for sure, or take off stuff off my to-do list. So for that, it's not helpful in the classical sense. It is useful in the sense that, yeah, maybe getting a bit back into that headspace of psychedelics without the full experience. And in that sense, it's useful if you use it after an intense psychedelic experience, maybe in the weeks afterwards, if you use some microdosing to kind of stay connected with the experience. And then on microdosing, also the reflections are perhaps a bit more precise, or maybe a bit more accessible. And then generally, I also like it as a tool or a thing to do while hiking or being out in nature. That seems very compatible for me. Yeah, those are kind of the use cases.
Yeah, yeah. I think, of course, there's also microdosing without having had any full on experience as well, and I think that some folks do find value in that. Yes, one way that I've come to kind of describe so much of the work that we're doing in general, but also things with like meditation or Kundalini yoga or something like that, is in a way we're kind of putting pressure on the parts of ourselves that aren't us, right? And the discomfort that can arise in that process is that we have misidentified as those things, right? Here's another analogy that might land it a little bit better. It's like all of life is a crucible, and we're the stuff, the material that's in the crucible, and we want life to purify us, right? We want to become that pure metal on the other side of the crucible, right? And in this process, right, there's the heat is turned up, right? You have to have heat to purify something, and as it becomes purified, the metal separates from the non-metal parts, the dross, the impurities, right? And this is the process of purification, but it can be very uncomfortable because we've misidentified ourselves and we believe that we are the dross. We believe that we are the impurities. And this is ego death, right? I mean, this is another description of ego death. Why it's so painful is because you believe you are the things that are going away, right? You believe you are the things that are being stripped from you in this experience. And that's annihilation, right? That's death, right? And then I like what you said earlier about sort of the realization of the continuity of consciousness after that ego death, right? You've identified yourself as these various different parts, attributes, whatever, and now they're going away. The psychedelic is just ripping them away from you, right? And you survive it, right? You come out on the other side and you're still there. Your consciousness is still continuing. And that very profoundly teaches you, it shows you, okay, obviously I am not those things that went away because I am still here.
Mm-hmm. I heard a quote when studying Buddhism, something like, the fire of inner discovery burns everything that you are not, something along those lines. And I find it accurate also for psychedelics. So it everything that you are not is kind of burnt away and you are purified, but it's also a fire, right? So it's going to be intense, and psychedelics are intense, so you have to calculate that in. So yeah, it's a way to purify. I think it might also be a way to alchemize. So maybe it might even be a way of forging parts of your personality or talents, uncovering them. I'm not sure. It seems that our use with psychedelics is still very young, like compared to some of the indigenous cultures who have used them for hundreds of years and seem to use them in some kind of alchemy way. And I think that's something where we only get to in a couple more generations of consciously using these tools. I think they have even greater potential than what we use them for now. But for now, we use them for therapy, and therapy is what we need at the moment. So that's already good enough. But who knows what else we could use them for?
Yeah. I think that's a good segue into like how we see the future of psychedelics and what potential and potential downfalls. I mean, I suppose to start on the darker side, when psychedelics first kind of came to the forefront in, I don't know, 50s and 60s, and perhaps before that, the military wanted to exploit it as like methods of potentially mind control or something. MK Ultra program. I don't know if you're familiar with any of this, but there's this question of like you're putting someone in a very, very vulnerable state, and there's the potential to influence them in ways, to support an agenda rather than to support, the well-being of the individual. I don't know. I think that there is, potential pitfalls there, but at least in my own experience, it tends to, I would say more often than not, psychedelics can lead to positive change, right? Because if nothing else, they're increasing your awareness of something. If you're able to surrender and you're able to just be through the experience, you will be more aware of something on the other side, and you will have kind of a greater capacity to show up and then work with the world. So I guess kind of a roundabout way of saying that I think the future of psychedelics, I see it very positively. I think it's wonderful, the work that here in the United States that MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, I think it stands for. They're doing a lot of great work. It seems to be very effective. I mean, we had done some of this work when psychedelics first came onto the scene, like in the 60s and 60s mainly. It was touted as potentially like a cure-all, very high rates of curing people from alcoholism, for example. And then it got criminalized and then kind of shut down for a while. And now we're kind of in that renaissance rediscovery phase where we're finding out it has really, really awesome potential. What are your thoughts on the long term? Yeah, positive or?
Yeah, I mean, generally positive for sure. I think there's lots of damage has been done in the last 50 years or since prohibition, um, that needs to be undone. And so right now we are even in the time of the boring work. If you ask me, I'm grateful that people like the people from the MAPS organization exist, who are willing to do this boring work of integrating this now back into our society. But if I could choose, I would even skip, the next 50 years, and maybe let's think about like in 50 or 100 years after, everybody agrees this is not bad stuff that is going to fry your brain and leave holes in your brain, and we are more open to use them as a society also. It would be interesting to think about what will happen then. I think I hope into the therapeutic part will be very integrated in a society, that it's clear that it's a go-to tool in psychotherapy for working with trauma, perhaps depression and other conditions. I can also imagine that we could have something like a rite of passage, which some older societies used to have. So, for example, the ego death experience that we describe, I think it's really a useful experience to have, and I would argue even that it would be cool as kind of a, maybe not mandatory, but as an offered experience for like young adults, like going into
Mm.
adulthood with the experience of letting go, surrendering, or having this death experience would really, change the outlook of young people on their life.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No, I think in the longer term, psychedelics might be a tool for realizing latent potentials within us as human beings. I mean, if you want to get really far out there, you look into like the yogic realm, and they talk about cities or certain powers, Sidhi, believe it's spelled Siddhi. So I'm not talking about city, City, but something else, right? And these are, you know, at least from the description of the text, pretty miraculous powers like, telekinesis, that sort of stuff, psychic communication. And, if you dig deep enough into some people's psychedelic experiences, then, there's certainly reports of things like psychic communication and stuff, which, I believe we're capable of these things, with or without psychedelics, but perhaps psychedelics will help open up some latent possibilities. It's exciting to me.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about before that reality does at least seem to become more malleable with psychedelics, and that's only like solo experiences. There's many reports of group experiences where they have where they can read each other's minds, and all sorts of crazy synchronicities happen. So lots of unexplored territory, and I certainly have this kind of radical um, idea that exploring our own minds should be kind of a human right, maybe like even written into some kind of constitution, where we say that at least the natural compounds, should be always accessible to people, or to those who want to use them, because at the end of the day, I mean, they occur in nature, and who knows why they occur. They certainly seem a bit like the food of the gods, as Terence McKenna would phrase it. And why forbid them? Let's leave them available for everybody.
Yeah, well, I totally agree.